The atmosphere inside the airplane buzzed with quiet energy. Businessmen adjusted their ties, families wrangled with carry-ons, and the soft murmur of conversation blended with the hum of first-class luxury. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, offering warm towels and champagne as passengers settled into their plush seats. Among them was Barron Trump, the 17-year-old son of former President Donald Trump. Tall and composed, he sank into his seat by the window, casually flipping through the in-flight menu. He had become accustomed to the quiet glances and hushed murmurs that followed him in public, but he preferred to keep a low profile. Then a subtle shift rippled through the cabin. A hush, a sudden spark of recognition passing from row to row. Clint Eastwood. The name spread in urgent whispers, drawing attention like a magnet. Barron glanced up, intrigued. The legendary actor, despite his age, still carried an undeniable presence. His gait was steady but measured, his rugged face lined with the weight of years and stories untold. Though his sharp eyes held wisdom, there was something else, fatigue perhaps, or the quiet resignation of a man who had seen too much. As Clint paused near the first-class section, an assistant leaned in, speaking softly with the flight attendant. There had been a mix-up. First class was fully booked, and Clint Eastwood, Hollywood's last cowboy, had been bumped to coach. Barron didn't hesitate. He rose from his seat and strode toward Clint with the same quiet confidence that once defined his father on the debate stage. "Mr. Eastwood," Barron said, his voice steady, "please take my seat. I insist." Clint's sharp eyes studied him, as if measuring the weight of the gesture. "Son," the actor said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You sure about this?" But Barron had already made up his mind. He gave a small nod, stepping aside. Neither of them realized it then, but this single act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. Clint Eastwood settled into Barron's seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests as he adjusted to the unexpected luxury. He exhaled slowly, the familiar scent of leather and polished wood mingling with the crisp cabin air. "You didn't have to do this, kid," Clint said, his voice low but carrying the weight of gratitude. There was a trace of surprise in his usually unreadable expression. Barron shook his head with an easy smile. "I wanted to." With that, he turned and made his way toward economy, disappearing into the crowded aisle. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Passengers exchanged stunned glances. Many recognized Barron, but this act of quiet humility, was something else. Even the flight attendants, trained to maintain composure, stole glances at one another, whispering in hushed tones. Clint, known for his unshakable demeanor, looked oddly affected. He shifted in his seat, trying to relax, but his mind kept replaying the moment. Meanwhile, Barron found himself wedged into a middle-seating coach, squeezed between a chatty salesman who smelled faintly of cologne and a weary mother struggling to soothe a fussy toddler. The air was thicker here, packed with the warmth of too many bodies in too little space. But Barron didn't seem to mind. He popped in his headphones, leaned back, and let the steady hum of the engines drown out the world. Back in first class, Clint ran a hand over his chin, deep in thought. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a worn notebook and a pen. Something about this moment stuck with him, the boy's quiet grace, the simplicity of his gesture. For the first time in years, Clint felt something stir inside him, a whisper of inspiration, a flicker of a story waiting to be told. As the plane soared at 35,000 feet, neither of them knew it yet, but fate had already begun weaving their lives together. Something extraordinary was set in motion, high above the clouds. An hour into the flight, the tranquility of cruising altitude shattered. The seatbelt signs blinked on with a sharp chime, and before anyone could react, the plane lurched violently. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as drinks toppled onto laps. Overhead bins rattled like unstable dominoes. Barron gripped the armrests, his eyes scanning the faces around him. The salesman beside him muttered a curse under his breath, white-knuckling his tray table. The exhausted mother next to him clutched her child, but the toddler let out an ear-piercing wail, overwhelmed by the sudden chaos. In first class, Clint Eastwood tensed. He had endured a lifetime of storms, both in the sky and in the unforgiving world below, but something about this one unsettled him. It wasn't just the turbulence itself, but the way it lingered, how it rattled the plane with an eerie persistence. He glanced back toward the economy cabin, his thoughts drifting to Barron. How was the kid holding up? Then it happened. A deafening crack tore through the aircraft. For a split second, the lights flickered, casting an eerie strobe effect over the anxious faces of the passengers. Gasps turned to cries. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing severe turbulence due to an unexpected storm system. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened." The pilot's voice was composed, but the tension underneath was unmistakable. Passengers clung to their armrests, eyes darting toward one another, seeking reassurance where none could be found. Clint exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had stared down danger before. But this was different. He felt it in his gut. His thoughts flickered to the boy who had given up his seat, now somewhere in the back of the plane, riding out the same storm. At 35,000 feet, two men, one whose legend had been cemented in time and another whose story was only just beginning, found themselves suspended between fate and uncertainty. Neither knew what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The night was far from over. The turbulence raged on, each violent jolt reverberating through Barron's chest. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to steady his breath as the plane bucked and dipped. Around him, whispered prayers mixed with choked gasps. A woman clutched a rosary. A man gripped his seat like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. The once talkative salesman beside Barron was now ghostly pale, his fingers clenched around the armrest in silent terror. In first class, Clint Eastwood sat rigid, staring out the window. Beyond the glass, lightning slashed through the sky, illuminating the rolling storm clouds in eerie bursts of silver. It was a sight he had seen countless times in movies, but there was no script here, no camera to capture the raw intensity of the moment. His thoughts drifted back to Barron. There was something about the kid's selfless act that lingered in Clint's mind. He had spent decades portraying heroes, men who stared down danger, fought the good fight, and walked away victorious. But here, in real life, he saw a different kind of courage, a quiet, unassuming kind that asked for nothing in return. The turbulence finally relented, easing into a shaky calm. A collective exhale swept through the cabin. Drinks were mopped up, hands unclenched, and nervous laughter flickered through the rows as people reassured each other that they were, in fact, still in one piece. Clint unbuckled his seatbelt. His movements were slower than usual, a mix of age and deep contemplation weighing on him. Steadying himself against the seats, he made his way down the narrow aisle, the hushed murmurs of passengers following him. He stopped when he reached Barron's row. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" Clint asked, his voice gruff but warm, a small smile softening the rugged lines of his face. Barron blinked in surprise but nodded. "Of course not." As Clint eased into the cramped space beside him, the nearby passengers exchanged stunned glances. The legendary actor and icon who had spent his life on red carpets and in directors' chairs, now squeezed into the narrow confines of economy, like it was the most natural thing in the world. For the next hour, the two of them talked, their voices low against the hum of the aircraft. "So tell me," Clint said, his sharp eyes studying Barron, "why'd you give up your seat?" Barron shrugged as if the answer was obvious. "It felt like the right thing to do." Clint tilted his head, intrigued. "You've given so much to people through your movies," Barron continued. "I just wanted to give something back." A chuckle rumbled through Clint's chest, his gravelly voice carrying a note of humility. "Never thought a seat could mean so much, huh?" Barron smiled. "It's not about the seat, it's about the gesture." Clint fell silent, his eyes dark with thought. "You know, people look at me and see someone who's done it all. The movies, the awards, the fame. But sometimes I wonder if I've made enough of a difference where it really matters." Barron studied him for a moment, then spoke with quiet certainty. "I think you have. You inspire people. Even now, just sitting here, you're making an impact." Clint looked at the young man beside him, something unspoken passing between them. A rare softness crossed his face, the weight of his years momentarily lifting. "You're wise beyond your years, kid." Around them, passengers listened, drawn into the unlikely conversation unfolding before their eyes. It wasn't just talk. It was something deeper, a connection. A bridge between two lives, one that had seen it all and one just beginning to carve its path. And at 35,000 feet, under the hum of the plane and the flickering glow of the cabin lights, something profound took root between them. The flight attendants exchanged glances, unable to ignore the unexpected sight in economy class. Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood icon, sat among ordinary passengers, deep in conversation with Barron Trump. It wasn't something you saw every day. Discreetly, one of them snapped a photo, sensing this moment would be remembered for years. Their conversation had moved beyond casual introductions. They spoke of legacy, of purpose, of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Barron admitted he wanted more than just a famous name. He wanted to define his own path, to stand for something beyond expectation. Clint, in turn, shared memories of his youth, of struggling to find his place, of the moments that shaped him into the man the world came to admire. As the plane began its descent, their conversation slowed. The storm outside had passed, but something had shifted between them, something unspoken, yet deeply understood. Clint reached into his pocket, scribbled down a number, and placed a firm hand on Barron's shoulder. "You reminded me of something today. It's not about where you sit, it's about who you sit with." Barron met his gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, for everything." As passengers prepared to disembark, a ripple of warmth filled the cabin. The turbulence had shaken more than just the plane. It had stirred something deeper in all of them. And then, just as Clint and Barron stepped off, a few passengers began clapping. It started small, hesitant, then grew, spreading through the terminal. Clint nodded modestly. Barron, caught off guard, smiled but kept his head down. Neither of them realized just how quickly their story was spreading. A flight attendant had shared the moment online, describing how Barron had quietly given up his first-class seat, how that single act of kindness had led to an unforgettable connection. By the time they reached baggage claim, the story was already trending. Reporters waited outside, cameras ready, eager to capture the moment. Clint, ever the steady presence, shielded Barron from the growing frenzy. "No comments for now," he said firmly, guiding the young man toward a waiting car. As they drove off, Clint glanced at Barron. "You ready for this?" Barron exhaled, shaking his head with a small grin. "Not really." Clint chuckled. "You'll be fine, kid. You've got something they can't teach." Barron raised a brow. "What's that?" "Heart." And in that moment, Barron understood. This wasn't just about him or Clint. It was about something bigger, something people needed to believe in. The next morning, Barron's phone vibrated relentlessly, lighting up with messages and missed calls. His parents were proud. His friends were in awe. Strangers, thousands of them, flooded his inbox with words of admiration and gratitude. Overnight, his quiet act of kindness had become a national story. But one call stood out, a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A familiar, gravelly voice came through the line. "Barron, this is Clint. Got a minute?" Barron sat up straight. "Of course." "I've been thinking about our conversation," Clint said, his tone contemplative. "There's a project I've had in mind for years. A film about kindness, about humanity, about how the smallest actions can change lives. And I think it's time to make it." Barron listened, unsure where this was going. "I want you involved," Clint added. Barron blinked. "Me? I'm not an actor." Clint chuckled. "You don't have to be. You've already inspired the story. I just need your perspective." Barron hesitated, the weight of the offer sinking in. The idea of stepping into something so public, so monumental, felt overwhelming. But then Clint's words from the flight echoed in his mind. "It's not about where you sit, it's about who you sit with." A slow smile spread across Barron's face. "I'd be honored." As they spoke, Clint felt something stir deep within him. This wasn't just another film. It wasn't about box office numbers or critical acclaim. It was about something bigger, about creating a story that could matter, that could change lives, just as Barron's simple act of kindness had changed his. Clint and Barron met a week later at Clint's studio, a space filled with history. Stacks of scripts, notes, and old film reels surrounded the legendary director, his mind already immersed in the project. Barron, stepping into this world, felt a momentary sense of unease. He was no filmmaker, no Hollywood insider. But Clint's easygoing presence and welcoming nod quickly put him at ease. "Let's start with what inspired you that day," Clint said, leaning forward. "Why did you give up your seat?" Barron hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I guess I've always believed small things matter," he said. "I've seen my parents do big things on a global scale, but I think real kindness starts in the everyday choices we make for one another." Clint nodded, jotting down notes. "That's the heart of it," he murmured. The more they talked, the clearer the story became. It wouldn't be about power, prestige, or politics. It would be about humanity, the simple, unseen choices that ripple outward, shaping lives in ways no one can predict. Clint decided the film would follow a series of interconnected stories, each ignited by a single act of kindness, much like Barron's moment on the plane. As they worked late into the evening, Barron realized how much he was learning, not just about filmmaking, but about life itself. Clint, the man who had spent decades crafting larger-than-life heroes, was now pouring his heart into something deeply personal. And as they laid the foundation for the film, neither of them could have predicted just how far its impact would reach. Months passed, and the project took form. Barron and Clint worked side by side, weaving together stories of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of kindness. Clint's decades of wisdom blended with Barron's fresh perspective, and soon their collaboration became more than just creative work. It became a friendship. One evening, as they sat in Clint's office reviewing scenes, Barron's eyes drifted to a framed photo on the wall. A younger Clint stood beside his parents, his father's arm draped protectively over his shoulder, his mother's warm smile full of pride. Clint followed Barron's gaze. "That was the last photo I took with them," he said quietly. His voice held a weight Barron hadn't heard before. "They taught me what it means to live a good life, not just a successful one." Barron let the words settle before asking, "Do you think they'd be proud of the man you've become?" For a long moment, Clint didn't answer. Then his eyes glistened, and he gave a small nod. "I hope so, kid. I hope so." It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and it struck something deep in Barron. For all of Clint's fame, for all the accolades he had collected, his heart was still anchored to the simple values he had been raised with. Barron realized then, this wasn't just a film, it was a legacy. As news of the project spread, Hollywood took notice. The unlikely collaboration between Clint Eastwood and Barron Trump fascinated reporters. Social media buzzed with anticipation. Fans of Clint's work were eager to see what many were already calling his next masterpiece. The film, titled The Power of One, followed 5 interconnected stories, each beginning with a simple act of kindness. Through love, loss, redemption, and hope, the film would explore how one moment, one choice, could change the course of countless lives. Clint poured his soul into directing. Barron, working behind the scenes, offered insights that shaped the film's emotional core. One of the stories, inspired by their shared flight, featured an aging man who gives up his last bit of comfort for a struggling young boy. That one act sets off a chain reaction, transforming an entire community. When production wrapped, Clint invited Barron to the set for the final scene. "This one's for you, kid," Clint said with a wink. Barron watched in silence as the cameras rolled, capturing a moment so raw, so powerful, it sent chills down his spine. He wasn't just witnessing the end of a film, he was witnessing the beginning of something far greater. The premiere of The Power of One was unlike anything Barron had ever experienced. The theater was a spectacle of flashing cameras and murmured excitement. Celebrities, critics, and devoted filmgoers filled the seats, all eager to witness Clint Eastwood's latest creation. Barron sat beside Clint, his pulse quickening. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this. Sensing his unease, Clint gave him a firm pat on the shoulder. "Just watch," Clint said with a knowing smile. As the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, the audience fell into an enraptured silence. The film unfolded, story by story, each moment brimming with raw emotion. Scenes of sacrifice, kindness, and redemption played out in seamless, interconnected narratives. There were gasps of surprise, bursts of soft laughter, and quiet sniffles as emotions ran deep. By the time the final scene played, a moment of reconciliation and gratitude, The theater was utterly still. No one moved. The weight of the story had settled over them completely. Then the credits rolled, and the silence broke into a roaring ovation. Clint stood first, acknowledging the crowd with a nod. But instead of basking in the praise, he turned and motioned for Barron to stand beside him. "This young man reminded me why stories matter," Clint said, his voice calm but powerful. "He's the reason this film exists." Barron felt heat rise to his face as the applause swelled, waves of appreciation crashing around him. In that moment, he understood. The small gesture he had made on that flight had set something extraordinary in motion, something far greater than he had ever imagined. The days following the premiere were a whirlwind. The Power of One became an instant phenomenon, not just for its cinematic brilliance, but for the way it touched people's hearts across the world. Reviews flooded in, calling it Clint Eastwood's most profound and heartfelt work. But more than that, it sparked something real. Viewers shared how the film inspired them, how it made them pause, reflect, and choose kindness in moments they might have otherwise ignored. Barron watched in disbelief as social media exploded with stories. People were paying for strangers' groceries. Long-lost friends were reaching out to one another. Parents were writing heartfelt letters to their children. Old grudges were being forgiven. Each story seemed to create another ripple, stretching far beyond the film itself. But it wasn't just strangers who were moved. The morning after the premiere, Barron's phone rang. His mother's voice was thick with emotion. "We're so proud of you." His father, a man of few sentimental words, simply said, "You did good, son." Barron sat on his bed for a long time after the call ended, staring at the screen, absorbing the weight of their words. For the first time, he felt something shift. He wasn't just Donald Trump's son. He was carving his own path. He picked up a pen and started writing. Clint had shown him that stories could change lives. Now he wanted to see how far his own story could go. A few weeks later, an unexpected invitation arrived. Clint had arranged a private screening of the film for children at a hospital. They could use some inspiration, Clint said when Barron called to thank him. The screening took place in a small auditorium within the hospital. Barron watched as the kids sat mesmerized, their faces lighting up with hope during moments of triumph, their eyes glistening during scenes of heartbreak. When the credits rolled, Clint and Barron stayed to answer questions. A young boy, no older than 10, hesitated before raising his hand. "Mr. Eastwood," he asked, voice timid, "does the boy in the movie ever meet the old man again?" Clint smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes life doesn't give us all the answers," he said, "but if you live with kindness, you'll find that good things have a way of coming back to you." The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied. But as they left the hospital, Clint turned to Barron with a knowing look. "That kid had a point," he said. Barron raised a brow. "You mean a sequel?" Clint smirked. "Maybe, but let's make sure we live the story first." A few days later, Barron found an envelope in his mailbox. There was no return address, no markings, just his name, handwritten in neat, careful script. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "Dear Barron, I was on that flight the day you gave up your seat. I've struggled with my faith in people for a long time, but your act of kindness gave me hope again. It reminded me that there's still good in the world. Watching you and Mr. Eastwood connect inspired me to reach out to my estranged son after 10 years. We're rebuilding what I thought was lost forever. Thank you for being an example of what humanity should be. You'll never know how much your actions meant to me. With gratitude, a fellow traveler." Barron sat still, reading the letter over and over, his vision blurring as the weight of it sank in. He had never met the person who wrote it. He might never know their name. But somehow, through one small moment on an ordinary flight, he had helped heal a wound he never knew existed. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it away in a safe place. A reminder. That kindness was never wasted. He carried the letter with him everywhere, a quiet reminder that even the smallest gestures could create ripples beyond imagination. One afternoon, over a quiet lunch at the studio, Barron slid the letter across the table to Clint. The seasoned actor read it, his expression softening. He ran a weathered finger over the words, nodding slowly. "This," Clint said, tapping the page, "is exactly what the film is about." Barron listened as Clint leaned back, his voice steady. "It's not about grand gestures. It's about how one act touches a life and then that life touches another. Barron nodded, but Clint wasn't done. This letter proves it, kid. What we did wasn't just a movie, it was real, and you sparked it. News of the power of one's impact spread like wildfire. Schools incorporated it into lessons on kindness. Businesses used its themes for team building. Charities saw an uptick in donations, many accompanied by notes reading, "Inspired by the power of one," and the letters kept coming. Strangers from around the world reached out, sharing how the film, or the real-life story behind it, had changed them. Acts of love, reconciliation, and second chances rippled outward, each one another link in the chain. One day, Barron looked at Clint and said, "I want to keep this going. What do we do next?" Clint smiled knowingly. "We let the story keep unfolding." Months later, Barron found himself standing in a packed auditorium, feeling completely out of place. Clint had invited him to a charity gala where the power of one was being honored for its influence on global kindness initiatives. Barron assumed he'd just be a spectator. He was wrong. When the time came to present the award, Clint took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the room, "I've spent my life telling stories on screen. But this one is different." He paused, scanning the audience. "This one started with a simple act, a young man giving up his seat, and that act reminded me, and hopefully all of us, what it truly means to be human." Then he turned and gestured toward Barron. "Barron Trump, come up here." The applause was deafening. Barron hesitated for half a second before making his way to the stage, his heart pounding. Clint handed him the award, a crystal sculpture shaped like two hands clasped together. Barron took a deep breath, gripping the microphone. "I'm not used to being in the spotlight," he admitted, his voice steady despite the nerves. "But if I've learned anything, it's this. Kindness isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. If we all choose kindness, the world changes, one small act at a time. Tears glistened in the eyes of many. The applause that followed shook the room. As Barron stepped off the stage, he realized something. He wasn't just accepting an award, he was embracing a calling. The next morning, Barron and Clint sat on a quiet bench overlooking the city, the gala's energy still lingering in their minds. Barron exhaled, shaking his head. "I never thought a single moment on a plane could lead to all this." Clint chuckled, stretching his legs. "Life's funny like that. Sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference." Barron gazed out at the skyline, lost in thought. "Do you think we've done enough?" Clint placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Kid, it's not about doing enough. It's about starting something that keeps going." Barron smiled, finally understanding. It was never about fame, never about recognition. It was about planting seeds of kindness and trusting that they would grow in the hearts of others. A quiet moment passed between them before Clint suddenly broke into a grin. "You know," he said, "we should probably tell people to keep this kindness thing going. Maybe invite them to join us." Barron laughed. "You mean, like, subscribe and comment?" "Exactly." Clint winked. Barron turned to an imaginary camera. "If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments how you've been inspired to spread kindness.